Feet first into hell. Why aliens whisper the name drop pod demons. The great chamber of the Galactic Council stretched upward like the inside of a cathedral. And within its curved walls sat representatives from 47 species, who had mastered the stars. Ambassador Kethvorn of the Silithine hegemony stood at the central platform, his insectoid body towering 3 meters tall, and his forearms spread wide as he addressed the assembly. "We speak today of the species called humanity," he said, and his voice carried the clicking undertones of his kind. "They have sent their petition for membership in this council, and I stand before you to argue against their admission." Murmurs rippled through the gathered aliens, and Kethvorn waited for silence before continuing. "The hegemony has studied these creatures for 2 of their decades," he declared. "They are violent and short-lived and primitive in their thinking, and they breed like vermin across every world they touch." He brought up a holographic display showing human colony worlds spreading across a spiral arm of the galaxy. In 300 of their years, they have claimed 92 worlds, Kethvorn continued. "They fight among themselves constantly, and they wage war over resources and ideology, and sometimes for reasons even they do not understand." Several council members nodded their agreement, and the Silithine ambassador felt satisfaction spread through his thorax. "The hegemony has conquered 12 species," he said proudly. "We have brought order to chaos and unity to the vision, and we know the signs of a dangerous species. When we see them," he pointed one clawed finger at the human delegation sitting in the observer gallery far above, "these creatures must be contained before they spread further," Kethvorn declared. "I call for a vote to deny their membership and to establish a quarantine around their territory." The human ambassador, a woman named Sarah Chun, watched from the gallery with an expression that revealed nothing. "Does anyone speak against this motion?" asked the council moderator, a being of pure energy who served as neutral arbiter. Silence fell across the chamber, and Kethvorn allowed himself a moment of triumph. Then a voice spoke from the elder seats. "I will speak." Every eye and sensor and psychic tendril turned toward Counselor Yineth of the Auravani, and the chamber grew cold with sudden tension. The Auravani were among the oldest species in known space, and they had watched empires rise and fall for 100,000 years. And when an elder of their kind spoke, wise beings listened. Yineth descended from her seat on legs that bent backward at the knee, and her 4 eyes reflected light that seemed to come from somewhere beyond normal space, and her silver robes trailed behind her like mist. "Ambassador Kethvorn speaks of humanity as though they are merely another young species to be managed," she said, and her voice was soft but carried to every corner of the chamber. "He speaks as one who has never faced them in battle." Kethvorn clicked his mandibles in annoyance. "The hegemony fears nothing," he declared. "Then you are a fool," Yineth replied, and gasps echoed through the assembly. 3 cycles ago, a Kovathi refugee ship reached Auravani space, and aboard that ship was a single survivor of the Kovathi expansion fleet. She paused and looked around the chamber with eyes that had seen civilizations burn. "The Kovathi sent 15,000 soldiers to claim a world they believed was undefended," Yineth continued. "They landed their troops and established their bases and prepared to harvest the native population as they had done on a dozen worlds before. What does this have to do with humanity?" Kethvorn demanded. "The world they invaded was called New Helsinki," Yineth said. "It was a human colony of 6 million souls." The chamber fell absolutely silent. The Kovathi expected easy conquest. The elder continued. "What they found was something else entirely. And the survivor I spoke with died 3 days after reaching us. But before he passed, I touched his mind and saw what he had witnessed." She closed her eyes and raised her hands. And suddenly, the chamber filled with a psychic projection that every being could perceive. They saw a world from orbit, green and blue and peaceful. Then they saw the sky tear open, streaks of fire screamed down through the atmosphere. Hundreds of them. And they fell not in careful landing patterns, but in wild, chaotic drops that seemed almost random. Metal coffins, Yeneth narrated. The humans call them drop pods, and they are barely large enough for a single soldier. And they fall from orbit at speeds that would kill any sane creature. The vision zoomed closer, and the council watched as one of the pods slammed into the ground near a Korvathi position. And the impact threw dirt and debris 50 meters in every direction. The pod cracked open. Inside was a human in black armor, and blood ran from a wound on its head. And one of its arms hung at a wrong angle. The Korvathi soldiers raised their weapons. The human looked at its broken arm and grabbed it with the other hand and pulled until the bones snapped back into place. And the creature did not scream, but instead made a sound that took the translator a moment to process. It was laughing. The human raised its weapon and charged directly at the Korvathi line, still laughing, and behind it more pods crashed down and more humans emerged, and they were all making the same terrifying sound. They sing, Yeneth said as the vision faded. They fall from the sky in metal coffins and break their bodies on impact, and then they sing as they kill you. She turned to face Kethvorin directly. The Korvathi expansion fleet numbered 15,000 of their finest warriors. She said, the humans lost 400 soldiers retaking their world, and of the Korvathi, only one survived to tell the tale. Impossible, Kethvorin sputtered. No species could. The Korvathi had a word for what came out of those pods, Yeneth interrupted. Before they died, they created a new word in their language, Akvalum. She looked around the chamber one final time. It translates roughly as the demons who fall. She said, I have lived for 9,000 years, and I have seen horrors that would shatter your minds. And I tell you now that I have never felt fear like what I felt in that dying Korvathi's memories. She began walking back to her seat. Vote as you will, she said over her shoulder. But pray to whatever gods you hold that humanity never has reason to look up at your worlds and wonder if those skies need to burn. Kethvorin stood in stunned silence for a long moment before he recovered his composure. Superstition and primitive fear, he declared. The hegemony will not be swayed by ghost stories. And I call for the vote. The vote passed by a narrow margin. And humanity was denied membership. Ambassador Chun watched the results with no change in her expression. And then she stood and walked quietly from the gallery. And her aide fell into step beside her. Orders, Admiral? The aide asked once they reached the corridor. Chun was quiet for a moment. Get me a secure channel to Fleet Command, she finally said. Tell them it is happening again. The aide nodded and hurried away. And Chun stood alone looking out a viewport at the stars, somewhere out there. Her people were about to learn that the galaxy had chosen to be there. Enemy, she wondered if the galaxy understood what that meant. She suspected it did not. Feet First into Hell, Part 3. The Devils due 72 hours into the battle for New Saskatchewan. Drone Commander Vrex still crouched in the ruins of what had once been a shopping center and tried to understand why his soldiers kept dying. He had fought 12 species across 3 star systems, and he had never lost a campaign, and his tactical record was considered flawless by hegemony standards. None of that mattered. Here, report, he ordered through the hive link that connected him to his remaining forces. The responses came back fragmented and confused. And through the shared consciousness of the swarm, he felt something he had never experienced before. His soldiers were afraid. They are everywhere, one squad leader reported. We establish a defensive position, and then more fall from the sky behind us, and we are surrounded. Pull back to secondary positions. Vrex still commanded. We cannot, came the reply. They predicted our fallback routes, and they are already there waiting. Vrex still processed this information with growing disbelief. That is impossible, he said. How could they know our plans? The answer came from a dying soldier on the Eastern Front. They watch us, the soldier transmitted. They study how we move and then they change their tactics, and what works against them once does not work again. The soldier's signal cut off as his life ended. And Rex Till felt the death echo through the hive mind like a cold wind. This was the first thing he learned about humans. They adapted every strategy he had used successfully against other species, failed against these creatures. And not because they were immune to his tactics, but because they learned so quickly. Tried flanking maneuvers and the humans developed counter-flanking patterns. He tried overwhelming numbers. And the humans created kill zones that turned numerical advantage into a liability. He tried psychological warfare, and the humans simply refused to be afraid. The second thing he learned was perhaps more disturbing. When a Silithine died, the entire hive felt it. And this shared suffering was supposed to be a strength because it bound the swarm together in common purpose, but it was also a weakness when enough soldiers died. The psychic backlash could paralyze entire units. And clever enemies had learned to target the hive nodes that amplified this effect. Humans did not share their pain. Rex Steel watched through a scout's eyes as a human soldier took a wound that should have been fatal, and the creature's companions did not collapse or hesitate, or show any sign of shared suffering. Instead, they got angry. They fought harder. One of them screamed something that the translator rendered as, "That was my friend," and then charged directly into a Silithine defensive position with no regard for personal safety. The position fell in minutes. The third thing Rex Steel learned was that humans were endurance predators. The Silithine could sprint, and they could swarm, and in short bursts they were faster and stronger than any human, but they could not maintain that pace forever. The humans could for 3 days. The assault had continued without pause. And Rex Steel's soldiers were exhausted and hungry, and their morale was shattered. The humans just kept coming. They rotated their units in seamless shifts that ensured fresh soldiers were always on the front line. And they did not seem to need sleep or rest or any of the things that normal creatures required. "They are machines," one of his officers suggested. "No," Rex Till replied. "Machines can be broken." And these things simply refused to stop. The fourth lesson was the worst of all. The sky screamed again. Rex Till looked up and saw the streaks of fire that he had come to associate with his nightmares. And more pods slammed into the ground behind his defensive line. And suddenly he was surrounded by enemies who had fallen from orbit, vertical envelopment. The humans called it, Rex Still called it, a horror beyond description across the city. Sergeant Major Vasquez led her squad through the ruins of a residential district and tried not to think about how many of her soldiers she had lost in the last 3 days. Private Park moved beside her with his rifle ready, and his broken ribs had been taped and his arm had been injected with nerve stabilizers. And he showed no sign of slowing down despite wounds that would have hospitalized any sane person. "How much farther to the objective?" he asked. 3 blocks, Vasquez replied. "Intel says there is a Silithine communication hub in the old government building, and taking it out will blind their entire Eastern Command. And then? Then we find the next objective, and we take that too." Park was quiet for a moment as they moved through the rubble. "Sergeant Major, can I ask you something?" "Make it quick. Why do we do this?" he asked. "Why drop pods instead of just bombing them from orbit?" Vasquez paused at a corner and checked for enemies before responding. "Because a bomb cannot look an enemy in the eye," she said. "A bomb cannot tell civilians that help has arrived. And a bomb cannot hold a position or accept a surrender or show mercy." She turned to look at him directly. "We are not here to destroy, Park. We are here to win. And winning means taking this ground and holding it and making sure these bugs understand that they cannot just come to our worlds and take what they want. But the cost. I know the cost, she interrupted, and her voice carried an edge of pain that she usually kept hidden. I have buried more friends than I can count, and every single one of them knew what they were signing up for. She started moving again. We drop because someone has to, she said. We drop because if we do not, then the people we are protecting have to fight instead. And they are not ready for this, and they should not have to be. An explosion lit up the sky to the south, and both soldiers dropped into cover instinctively. Besides, Vasquez added with a grim smile, there is something satisfying about seeing the look on their faces when we fall out of the sky. Park found himself smiling despite everything. You are completely insane. Sergeant Major, welcome to the Drop Troopers. Kid. They reached the communication hub an hour later and fought their way inside through 3 layers of silithium defenders. And Park killed more enemies than he could count and took 2 more wounds that should have stopped him but did not. By the time they reached the central control room, his armor was covered in blood. Both human and alien Vasquez planted the charges while Park held the door. Fire in the hole, she announced. The hub exploded and silithium communications across the eastern front went dark far above the planet. The silithium queen watched the battle through the eyes of her dying commanders and felt something she had never experienced in her 1,000 years of life. She felt fear. Authorized chemical bombardment, she ordered her fleet commanders. My queen, our own troops are already dead, she interrupted. Kill everything on the surface, and we will start again with fresh forces. The order was given, the chemicals fell, and the queen believed she had finally found a way to break these demons. She was wrong. Feet First into Hell, Part 4. They do not break. The chemical weapons fell like yellow rain across New Edmonton. And where they touched, everything died. Silithium and human alike collapsed as the poison ate through their lungs and their blood and their nervous systems. And the screams lasted only a few seconds before silence spread across the battlefield. The queen watched from her command ship in low orbit and felt satisfaction spread through her ancient mind. The threat is neutralized. Ambassador Keth Voran reported to the Galactic Council. Humanity has been contained as promised, and the hegemony's victory is complete. For 12 hours, nothing moved on the surface of New Saskatchewan. Kemptons prepared his victory speech and imagined the accolades he would receive for solving the human problem. Then, the pods fell again. This time they did not aim for the ground kernel. Marcus Webb stood at the front of his assault team as their modified drop pods screamed toward the silithium command ship, and his face showed nothing but cold determination. His service record was the stuff of legend among the drop troopers. 32 combat drops across 9 worlds. Clinically dead, twice from wounds that should have killed him permanently. Exposed to hard vacuum once when his pod breached during descent, he had survived all of it. Doctors said he was running on spite and stimulants, and Webb saw no reason to correct them. 30 seconds to contact his pod computer, announced. Webb checked his weapon one final time and said a prayer to a god he was not sure existed. We fall so others may rise, he whispered. Pod hit the hull of the command ship and its shaped charges blew through 3 meters of bioorganic armor, and Webb was moving before the debris finished falling. His squad poured through the breach behind him, and they found themselves in a corridor that pulsed with the living tissue of the silithium. Vessel alien warriors rushed to meet them. Webb killed the first 3 with his rifle, and the 4th with his knife when his weapon jammed, and he kept moving forward through the ship like death itself had taken physical form. Push for the command center, he ordered. The queen dies today, on the planet below. Sergeant Major Vasquez crawled out from beneath the rubble of a collapsed building, and took a breath of filtered air through her emergency mask. The chemicals had caught her squad in the open, and she had done the only thing she could think of. She had blown up a wall and buried them under the debris, and hoped the sealed environment would protect them from the worst of the poison it had. Worked mostly, she did a head count and found 4 survivors out of 12. Herself, Park, Corporal Santos, and Private Chumpark was barely conscious, and his breathing came in wet rattles that suggested his lungs had been damaged despite the protection. And his skin had a gray pallor that frightened Vasquez more than she wanted to admit. "Can you move?" she asked him. "I can try." "That is not what I asked." Park forced himself to his feet and nearly collapsed, and Vasquez caught him before he could. "Full. I can move," he insisted. She looked at his ruined body and saw something in his eyes that she recognized from her own reflection. Spite, pure, stubborn human spite that refused to die simply because dying was what the enemy wanted. "Good enough," she said. "We have civilians to protect." They made their way through the poisoned streets to a hospital where 300 colonists had been sheltering, and they found the building surrounded by Silithine soldiers who had survived the chemical attack in their sealed armor. "We cannot fight through that many," Santos observed. "We do not have to," Vasquez replied. "We just have to hold them off until reinforcements arrive." "What reinforcements?" Vasquez pointed up at the sky, where the flashes of weapons fire marked the assault on the command ship. "Those reinforcements." They fortified the hospital as best they could and prepared to make their stand. The Silithine attacked in waves, and each wave pushed a little closer to the doors, and each wave cost Vasquez another piece of her dwindling ammunition supply. Park propped himself against the doorframe and kept firing despite the blood that leaked from the corners of his mouth with every breath. Silithine soldier broke through the perimeter and charged directly at him, and Park was too slow to bring his weapon around the way. Alien grabbed him by the throat and lifted him off the ground. "Why do you fight?" the Silithine demanded, and its translator rendered the words in harsh metallic tones. "Your commanders are dead, your army is broken, and your world belongs to us now." Park looked down at the creature that was crushing his windpipe and managed to smile. "Because they are my people," he gasped. "And you are in my house." He pulled the grenade from his belt and shoved it into the gap between the alien's armor plates. The Silithine dropped him and tried to remove the explosive, and Park crawled away as fast as his broken body could manage. The grenade detonated. Park felt shrapnel tear through his leg, but he was alive and the alien was not. And that was all that mattered above the planet. Colonel Webb reached the Queen's chamber after fighting through 7 decks of defenders and leaving a trail of bodies behind him. The chamber was vast and organic and pulsing with light, and at its center sat the Queen herself, a massive creature twice the size of her warriors, with a crown of sensory tentacles that waved in agitation. "Human?" she said, and her voice carried harmonics that vibrated through Webb's bones. "You have killed my children and invaded my ship and brought war to my people. You started this," Webb replied. "We are just finishing it." The Queen extended her psychic senses toward Webb's mind. Searching for fear or weakness or anything she could exploit, she found chaos. Human minds were not like hive minds, and they were not orderly or unified or peaceful. They were storms of competing impulses and contradictory emotions and memories that made no logical sense. And underneath it all, burning like a star at the center of Webb's consciousness, was something the Queen had never encountered before. Spite, raw, blazing refusal to die or surrender or stop fighting for any reason, at any time, under any circumstances. It terrified her. "I offer surrender," she said, and the words came out in a rush, not of my fleet but of myself. "And I will give you anything you want." Webb was quiet for a long moment. "Keep your territory," he finally said. "But you are going to deliver a message for me." "What message?" Tell the council what happened here, Webb said. Tell them what we did and what we could have done. And make sure they understand one thing. He stepped closer to the Queen and looked directly into her primary eyes. We did not start this, he said. We finished it, and next time we will not be so gentle. The Queen looked at this small, fragile creature that had torn through her ship like it was nothing, and she believed every word he said. The message will be delivered. She promised. Webb nodded and turned to leave behind him. The Queen began to compose the transmission that would change the galaxy forever. 3 weeks after the council vote, the Silithine hegemony came to the human colony, world of New Saskatchewan, with 200 bioships and 250,000 soldiers. They expected a quick victory. The orbital defense stations fought hard but fell within 6 hours. And the Silithine commanders felt satisfaction as their landing craft descended through the clouds toward the capital city of New Edmonton, where Master Desic stood at the front of the first wave, his mandibles clicking with anticipation as the ground rushed up to meet them. Prepare for resistance, he ordered his troops. The humans will fight, but they will break. And by nightfall, this world will belong to the hegemony. The landing craft touched down in the central plaza of New Edmonton, and Desic was the first to emerge with his weapon raised and his senses alert. He found nothing. The city was empty. No humans cowered in the streets, and no defenders fired from the windows, and the only sound was the wind moving through abandoned buildings. Where are they? One of his lieutenants asked. Desic moved through the plaza with growing unease, and his soldiers spread out to search the surrounding blocks. And everywhere they found the same thing: empty homes with meals still on tables, and empty schools with lessons still written on boards, and empty hospitals with equipment still running. They knew we were coming, Desic realized. They evacuated the entire city. He looked up at the sky and wondered where 40 million humans had gone, far above the planet, hidden in the shadow of a gas giant at the edge of the system. The Terran Federation carrier Normandy drifted in silence alongside her sister ships in the launch bays of these massive vessels. Thousands of soldiers checked their weapons and armor and prepared for what was coming. Sergeant Major Elena Vasquez walked down the rows of drop pods, and her boots echoed on the metal deck as she inspected her squad. She had done this 31 times before, and she had the scars to prove it. And her face showed the calm focus of someone who had made peace with death long ago. Listen up, she called out. And her squad gathered around her. Intel says 250,000 bugs on the ground, and they think they have already won this fight. She smiled, and it was not a kind expression. We are going to educate them. Private First Class Tommy Park stood at the back of the group, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped his rifle. And he hoped no one noticed. This was his first drop. He had trained for 2 years in simulators and low-altitude jumps, but nothing could truly prepare a person for falling from space in a metal coffin barely big enough for their body. Vasquez noticed him and walked over. First time, Park? She asked. Yes, Sergeant Major. She put a hand on his shoulder. You are going to be scared, she said. That is normal, and that is good because fear keeps you sharp. But when those doors open, you put the fear in a box and you do your job. Understood? Understood, Sergeant Major. Good, she said. And she turned to address the whole squad again. These bugs think they are predators, but they have never hunted anything that hunts back. And today, we teach them what it means to be prey. An alarm sounded through the bay, and red lights began flashing. And a voice came over the speakers. All units prepare for drop in 10 minutes. The soldiers moved to their pods, and Park climbed into his and felt the metal walls close around him like a coffin. And his heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. Through his helmet radio, he heard the pre-drop ritual beginning. Feet first into hell. Vasquez said, Feet first. The company responded. We fall so others may rise, she continued. We fall. We are the thunder from a clear sky. We are the thunder, and when they ask who came for them, they will know our names, Park whispered the words along with his squad. And somehow the fear became smaller. The countdown reached 0, the bay doors opened beneath the pods. And for one terrible moment, Park looked down through his viewport and saw the planet far below. And it seemed impossible that any sane person would do what he was about to do. Then the clamps released and he was falling. The pod screamed through the void and hit atmosphere like a meteor. And fire wrapped around the tiny vessel as friction tried to tear it apart. And Park felt his bones shake and his teeth rattle and his vision blur at the edges. He could hear nothing but the howl of air and the shriek of tortured metal. The altimeter on his display spun downward with terrifying speed. 50,000 meters, 30,000 meters, 10,000 meters. Retros. In 3, his pod computer announced. 2, 1. The world turned to fire and noise as the retro rockets ignited. And Park felt his spine compress as the pod decelerated from terminal velocity to something merely lethal. He hit the ground. Impact threw him against his restraints, hard enough to crack 2 ribs. And his vision went white with pain. And for a moment, he thought he was dead. Then the pod blew open and sunlight poured in and training took over. Was out of the pod and moving before his brain caught up with his body. And all around him he could see other pods slamming into the ground and cracking open and disgorging soldiers, who moved like demons with their black armor smoking from re-entry A. Silithine warrior appeared in front of him and raised its weapon. Park shot it in the face. The alien fell and Park kept moving. And somewhere behind him, Vasquez was shouting orders, and the air filled with the sounds of gunfire and screaming. He found cover behind a wrecked vehicle and took a moment to assess his situation. His ribs screamed with every breath, and blood ran from a cut on his forehead, and his left arm tingled in a way that suggested nerve damage. He was alive. All around him the battle raged, and pods continued to fall from the sky like rain. And everywhere the Silithine lines crumbled under the weight of enemies who fell from nowhere. A transmission came through from Vasquez. Park. On me, we are pushing for the command center. He rose from cover and ran toward her position. And a Silithine soldier tried to block his path. And he hit it with the butt of his rifle hard enough to crack its exoskeleton. The alien collapsed and Park kept running. He reached Vasquez and fell in beside her. And together they pushed forward through streets that had been quiet an hour ago and now burned with the fires of war. "How are you holding up, rookie?" Vasquez asked between shots. "I think my ribs are broken." "Only 2?" She laughed. "That is a good first drop." Somewhere behind them, a Silithine commander watched his carefully planned invasion dissolve into chaos. And he tried to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Raised his communicator to send a message to the fleet. "We need reinforcements," he said. "The humans are." A pod crashed through the roof of his command post. Last thing he saw was a human woman climbing out of the wreckage with her arm bent at an impossible angle. And she looked at the damage and laughed. And she grabbed the broken limb and pulled until it snapped back into place. She raised her rifle. "Hello." "Beautiful," she said. Then she fired. The War Master died without ever understanding what had hit him far above the planet. The Silithine fleet commanders watched their ground forces fall apart. And they realized with growing horror that the primitive species they had come to conquer was something far worse than they had imagined. The pods kept falling, and the humans kept laughing. 2 weeks after the Battle of New Saskatchewan, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session. And the chamber that had once echoed with confidence now trembled with fear. The Silithine Queen stood at the central platform where Ambassador Kethvoran had stood before her, and her massive form seemed somehow diminished by what she had witnessed. "I come before this council not to boast of victory," she began, and her voice carried none of the arrogance that had marked Silithine diplomacy for centuries. "I come to beg for peace." Murmurs swept through the assembled species, and Kethvorn stared at his queen in disbelief from his seat in the hegemony delegation. "My queen, surely we cannot." "Silence," she commanded, and the weight of her authority crushed his protest before it could form. She turned back to the council. "I sent 250,000 soldiers to claim a human world," she said. "I believed we would sweep aside their defenses and add their territory to our hegemony. And I was wrong." She paused and let the silence stretch. 80,000 of my children died on that planet," she continued. "They were killed by creatures who fell from the sky in metal coffins and fought through wounds that would kill any sane being. And they laughed as they did it." Elder Counselor Yunath nodded slowly from her seat. "I warned you," she said softly. "I told you what they were." "You did," the queen acknowledged. "And I did not listen because I could not imagine that any species could be as terrible as you described." She raised one of her manipulator arms and activated a holographic display that showed the chemical bombardment and its aftermath when conventional forces failed. "I ordered chemical weapons deployed across the battlefield," she said. "I killed thousands of my own soldiers along with thousands of humans. And I believed I had finally won." The display shifted to show the pods falling again 12 hours later. "They came back," the queen said, and her voice cracked with something that might have been terror. "They came back and they assaulted my command ship directly. And they fought through 7 decks of defenders to reach my chamber." She looked around the council at the representatives of 47 species, who had never truly understood what lurked at the edge of their space. "I touched their commander's mind," she continued. "I have lived for 1,000 years, and I have read the thoughts of 100 species. And I have never felt anything like what I found in that human's consciousness." "What did you find?" asked the moderator. "Spite," the queen answered. "Burning endless spite that refuses to accept defeat under any circumstances. And it was so strong that it hurt to perceive." She lowered her manipulator arm and the display faded. "They could have killed us all," she said. "After what we did with the chemical weapons, they had every right to glass our fleet from orbit and leave none of us alive, and they chose not to. Why?" Kethvorn demanded. "If they had the power to destroy us, why show mercy?" "Because that is what makes them truly terrifying," the queen replied. "They are not mindless killers who destroy everything in their path. And they are not conquerors who seek to dominate other species." She pointed toward the human delegation in the observer gallery. "They are protectors," she said. "They fight and die and suffer, not because they enjoy violence, but because they believe it is their duty to protect those weaker than themselves. And they will endure any hardship and pay any price to fulfill that duty." The chamber was silent. "They gave me a message to deliver," the queen continued. "They said, 'We did not start this, and we finished it. And next time we will not be so gentle.'" She let those words hang in the air. "I believe them," she said. "And I recommend this council do the same." The vote to grant humanity full membership in the Galactic Council passed without a single voice in opposition 6 months later. On the rebuilt colony world of New Saskatchewan, a memorial stood in the central plaza of New Edmonton. The statue depicted a drop pod, cracked open like a seed. And from within, it emerged a figure with arms raised toward the Sky Lieutenant Elena Vasquez. Stood before the memorial with a cane she would need for another year while her shattered leg finished regenerating. And beside her stood Corporal Tommy Park with his arm still wrapped in a regenerative sleeve. They had both been promoted after the battle, and they had both nearly died a dozen times during the fighting. And they were both still here. "I still have nightmares," Park admitted quietly. "About the drop and the fighting and the chemical attack. That is normal," Vasquez replied. "It means you are still human. Does it ever get easier?" "No," she said, "but you get stronger. A shuttle descended from orbit and landed at the edge of the plaza. And from within it emerged a delegation of Silithine diplomats led by a young officer who had been born after the war. This was the first cultural exchange between humans and the hegemony, and the entire galaxy was watching to see what would happen. The Silithine delegation approached the memorial and stopped a respectful distance away, and their leader stepped forward with something clutched in his manipulator arms. "We bring a gift," he said. A word. Vasquez raised an eyebrow. "The Silithine hegemony has created a new term in our language to describe your species," the diplomat explained. "This word has spread across the galaxy in the months since the war, and it is now used by nearly every species we have encountered." "What is the word?" "Keth, volume Amnath," the Silithine said. "It translates roughly as the demons who show mercy." Park made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Demons who show mercy," he repeated. "That is quite a name. It is meant as the highest compliment," the diplomat assured him. "You have the power to destroy anyone who threatens you, and you choose instead to offer peace to those who surrender. And that combination of strength and restraint is something the galaxy has never seen before." Vasquez nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling us," she said. The Silithine delegation moved to place offerings at the base of the memorial, and as they did, a child from the colony broke free from her mother's grasp and ran toward them. She was no more than 6 years old, and she had no memory of the war. And in her hand she clutched a small yellow flower. The lead diplomat froze as the tiny human approached him. "For you?" the child said. And she held up the flower with a smile that showed missing teeth. The Silithine looked down at this small creature, who showed no fear of the species that had tried to conquer her world. And he felt something shift in his understanding of the universe. He reached down with trembling manipulator arms and accepted the flower as gently as he could. "Thank you, hey," said the child, giggled, and ran back to her mother. And the diplomat stood holding the flower like it was the most precious thing in the galaxy. Vasquez watched the interaction with a small smile on her face. "Think they will ever stop being afraid of us?" Park asked. "No," she replied. "Fear is too useful as a deterrent." "That seems sad." "Maybe," Vasquez acknowledged. "But maybe one day they will understand why we do what we do. And maybe that understanding will be worth more than the fear ever was." She watched as more colonists approached the Silithine delegation with gifts and greetings and questions about their home world. "That is a start," she said above them. The sky stretched clear and blue with no trace of the pods that had once fallen like rain, but everyone who looked up knew that the pods were still there, waiting in the bellies of ships that circled distant stars. Ready to fall again if needed, ready to protect, ready to show mercy, ready to remind the galaxy why they whispered the name. Drop pod demons, and somewhere in the void between stars, the species of the galaxy told stories to their children about the creatures from Earth who fell from the sky in metal coffins and laughed as they killed and forgave their enemies when the killing was done. They told these stories not to frighten their young, but to teach them a lesson that the Silithine had learned the hard way. Do not threaten what humans love, because the demons will come for you, and whether they show you mercy, that depends entirely on you.